Hi, this is Bob Whitaker, and welcome to Civs 101. On today's episode, we'll be looking at the Egyptian Civ, led in Civilization 6 by Cleopatra VII. Egypt is one of the original 14 Civs from Civilization 1 and has been synonymous throughout the series with building wonders and exponential city growth. Throughout that time, the Egyptian Civ has often been led by Cleopatra, who represents an obvious choice to diversify the male-heavy leadership from the first games in the series. But what makes Cleopatra such an interesting choice as a leader is the fact that she is so heavily represented in historical fiction outside of games. To help me understand Cleopatra and her long history in historical fiction, I've invited onto the show Dr. Prudence Jones, who is a professor of classics and general humanities at Montclair State University. Professor Jones' research interests include Cleopatra VII, Augustan Rome, Latin literature, and ancient geography. She is the author of Cleopatra, a Sourcebook, as well as a standalone biography of Cleopatra, and her work on Cleopatra has been featured in USA Today, Der Spiegel, NBC News, and on the Discovery Channel. Prudence, thank you so much for joining me on Civs 101.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Prudence, Cleopatra is not only one of the most famous people in history, but also one of the most famous people who's commonly depicted in historical fiction. And I'm wondering, what do you think it is about Cleopatra that makes her so compelling for storytellers, and in this case, game developers?
I think there are a few things about Cleopatra that make her really attractive and have made her really attractive for centuries. There's a lot of potential with Cleopatra. So we have a few characteristics that we know about her from the ancient sources. One, she was very powerful. I think we're always fascinated by power. Cleopatra was not only a queen, a pharaoh, but she was considered a living god by the Egyptians. In addition, she happened to become part of one of the most significant moments in history, the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. So, right there, she's got your attention already. An additional aspect to her ancient history, let's say, is the fact that the Romans really cast her as the villain. Just like power, we're fascinated with villains. And Cleopatra, during her lifetime, had many identities: ruler, goddess, enemy, Egyptian, Greek. She presented herself in a number of different ways to different audiences. So already in her lifetime, she can represent different things to different people. And then when we think about going forward in history, of course, when we're dealing with the ancient world and looking back from our perspective in the modern period, we have to realize that the evidence we have about the ancient world is inevitably partial.
Mm-hmm.
So much of what there was is missing, and so much went unrecorded. Frequently, things like motives are left to be filled in by historians. So, because of that, a number of aspects of Cleopatra come through to us, or can come through to us, as something of a blank slate. Um, she lends herself to being reimagined. And a lot of these reimaginings of Cleopatra in art and literature throughout various periods, like late antiquity, the Renaissance, and so forth, almost tell us as much about the people doing the reimagining as they tell us about Cleopatra.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, every culture can kind of remake Cleopatra in its own image. She can be a kind of canvas onto which artists can project a whole lot of things, maybe ambivalence toward female power, fascination with the exotic, romantic notions about perfect love, etc.
Yeah, and, to that point, we've got a kind of a historical reimagining of Cleopatra going on here in this game. We've got, kind of her character profile sheet here in the game's encyclopedia called the Civlopedia. This encyclopedia entry gives you a little bit of historical context here. And of course, within the first paragraph, we get mention of Rome, right, and how important Rome is in shaping kind of our modern perception of Cleopatra and Cleopatra's story. And, it's something you touched on there with your introduction. And, I'm wondering, Cleopatra's story, outside of civilization, outside of this game, is often told through the lens of Roman history, particularly this relationship with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And I'm wondering, could you give us a sense of how the Romans viewed Cleopatra? And furthermore, is there any sense in which we should question Roman stories about Cleopatra?
Sure. In very brief, yes, we should absolutely question what the Romans have to say about Cleopatra. The fact that so much of what we know about Cleopatra comes to us via Roman sources, or at least sources associated with the Roman Empire. People like Plutarch were Greeks living in the Roman Empire, but nonetheless, they kind of had the Roman perspective on things. So, interestingly, the Roman sources or Roman influenced sources represent the vast majority of information from the ancient world that we have about Cleopatra. We don't have, for instance, a narrative history written in Egyptian that covers Cleopatra. So we have just a lot more volume coming from the Roman side of things. And that tends to shape future perceptions of her. And of course, because Rome's major interaction with Cleopatra was somewhat controversial, those sources tend to have a fairly negative bias toward her, right? So for the Romans, Cleopatra was problematic. She was a hard person to categorize because she was a woman and also a head of state. That's not really a category the Romans had within their own culture. The political arena was overwhelmingly male for the Romans. Women did not hold political office. So the roles like political leader or leader of an army and mother would never be combined for a Roman woman, except maybe in the mythical prehistory of Rome. This wouldn't be something that the Romans of the Roman Republic would have seen. And yet here's Cleopatra, a head of state who is also leaning into her representation as a mother, being associated with the goddess Isis, having her infant son Caesarion as her co-ruler. So this would have probably been a bit confusing for the Romans. And in fact, one of the things that they latch onto as far as sort of defining Cleopatra as an enemy is the fact that she's a woman. In addition, of course, she's the perfect person for Octavian to declare war on when he wants to fight Antony, but Rome, of course, is kind of anti-civil war, although they had plenty of them. Say they were having them. It's a fine line they have to walk. On the one hand, a lot of invective gets thrown at Cleopatra by Roman sources, and it's very traditional, typical invective that gets tossed at women who step outside of their prescribed roles. So we can see this, with other women, even Roman women. Cicero just comes right out and in one of his letters says, I detest the queen. So he did not have a lot of popularity at Rome. And in fact, one of the sort of rallying cries on Octavian's side against Antony was, we can't have Antony and Cleopatra win this war because if they do, Cleopatra will dispense laws from the Capitoline Hill in Rome. And that, would be some sort of horrible taboo, basically.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, Octavian also has to frame Cleopatra as a worthy enemy, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Roman state, essentially, represented by him, is declaring war on Cleopatra. So she has to also be seen as powerful and strong enough to warrant a military response from the Roman world. So, there's a little bit of a being caught in a bind here. And so we see a lot of that getting worked out in the sources. There's a poem of Horace that basically starts out celebrating the victory over Cleopatra and, how basically Eastern, effeminate, dissolute she and her forces were. But then by the end of the poem, she is in some ways elevated because her defeat, followed by her suicide, her deciding to take her own life, is portrayed as somewhat honorable. And so she's almost, in a way, masculinized as a proper enemy by the end of that little narrative. So we see the Romans kind of struggle with this.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, as you pointed out at the beginning, that this occurs at the transition from the Republic to the Empire in Rome. And it seems like it'd be really useful for, say, Octavian or soon to be Caesar Augustus, that to have this kind of great enemy, to have this great other upon which you kind of base your empire upon. It's like, oh, I've defeated this great enemy from overseas, and now here I am with this new transition in this government. But it's warranted because otherwise we would have been destroyed by this sorceress from across the seas.
A good point, because Cleopatra was sort of one of the pillars of the so-called Triple Triumph that he celebrated. And again, sort of presenting himself as the great conqueror, as the one who was going to sort of save Rome. He claimed that what he was doing was, quote, restoring the Roman Republic. Of course, he was doing something quite different, but political propaganda is a wonderful thing. So, yeah, the triumph over Egypt, over Cleopatra, was presented as kind of symbolic of the victory of West over East. So Egypt can be represented as all of the things that, are non-Roman. The Romans are manly. They represent the West. They work hard. They are farmers. They're very hardy individuals. Whereas in the East, everyone's very effeminate. They just have banquets all the time. They're largely drunk. And, we can't trust those people. And so we have the triumph over Egypt, the climactic third day of the Triple Triumph. And we see things, like the coin that Octavian mints to commemorate that with a crocodile and the words Aegypto capta on it, Egypt captured. So yes, that victory over Cleopatra is parlayed into sort of the triumph of West over East, the triumph of the traditional Roman values.
And isn't it right? I think I remember reading this from one of your books, that Augustus in his triumph, his parade, coming back from defeating Cleopatra and Antony's forces. He had made a bust of Cleopatra in death as kind of a way to parade this great enemy through the streets of Rome. And I mean, I think it's like an interesting thing. It's like not only have we defeated this enemy, but we've in a way kind of captured her body, captured her spirit, and now here she is in Rome. And I guess the coin does a similar thing.
Yes. Yeah, and that's true. He did have a representation of Cleopatra. There's the ancient sources, some of them suggest that perhaps Octavian was disappointed that Cleopatra had taken her own life because his desire had been to actually march her as a captive, probably in golden chains, through the streets of Rome. I'm not sure, because women captives are a tricky thing. Yes, certainly you want to represent the different things that you get from your triumph, and prisoners of war would certainly be one category of people who might participate unwillingly in a triumph, along with, if there were any exotic animals from that location. The Romans loved some exotic animals. Placard with representations of the place. You could imagine sort of the Nile River painted on a placard that would be carried along in the parade. But Julius Caesar had actually displayed one of Cleopatra's siblings, Arsinoe, in a triumph, and this kind of backfired because seeing this woman in chains march through the street, she was quite young, elicited a lot of sympathy from the Roman people. And so while these captives would usually be executed afterwards, she was not. She was merely sent into exile.
Okay.
So it's a tricky thing. So one wonders whether Octavian might have been secretly a little grateful for that out of not having to march a woman in chains down the streets of Rome, because that can have the opposite effect as intended on the Roman people.
Right. And I'm kind of wondering, it's the Romans who kind of establish the narrative on Cleopatra, but I'm wondering, from kind of modern scholarship, from modern classics, do you feel that Cleopatra has gotten a fair shake, a fair determination from modern scholars, or do you feel like there's maybe a little bit of lingering sexism at play with kind of our current interpretations on Cleopatra and her history?
Yeah, I think it is really hard to get away from that bias that we get from the Roman sources, because they do tell such a good story and do things like attribute motive to Cleopatra and other players in the events. But I think there's been a lot of really good stuff recently. I think the tendency that sort of got going in the Renaissance and then continued into a lot of historical fiction with Cleopatra is the tendency to emphasize the Cleopatra and Antony love story. And I think that sort of really gains steam from Shakespeare. I think when Shakespeare did that, it was, that became so. There are certain representations that become iconic. Shakespeare, Elizabeth Taylor. So it's very hard to get out from under some of those, which really, Elizabeth Taylor in Americans of a certain time period, Cleopatra and Elizabeth Taylor are kind of the same person. So it's very hard to get away from that. But I think there have been a lot of recent things that do a really good job of trying to sort of unpack Cleopatra more as a political strategist. I'm thinking of like Stacy Schiff's recent book, or somewhat everything before the pandemic. I still think is recent.
That's fair. I'm in the same boat.
We've been in March of 2020 for like 2 years now. but I think there's, Cleopatra in, and even going back further than that, there's been an effort to do some kind of a corrective. For instance, even like back in 2000, there was a Cleopatra exhibition that came to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And when it opened, the New York Times had on the cover of its arts section some of the images of Cleopatra from the exhibition and the headline, Cleopatra, the first career woman. So I do think there have been some efforts to swing the pendulum back from just the Antony and Cleopatra romantic love story.
Well, that's good to hear. So moving on, kind of taking Egyptian history more broadly as it's depicted in this game. This is a game called Civilization. It's based on the players taking on the role of a particular civilization. And, this idea of looking at civilizations as a concept, it kind of harkens back to a different era of historical study that's based around, kind of arbitrarily constructed groups of people, usually living in the ancient era. And I'm wondering, what do you make of this use of the term civilization when it's applied to Cleopatra's Egypt in particular?
I don't think it's necessarily misplaced. Um, Interesting that you bring that up. Actually, classicists have been recently doing a lot of thinking about, how do we define our field and what do we call it? Do we, as traditionally, call it classics? Is it better to try to be a bit more precise and say Greek and Romans, ancient Greek and Roman studies, or ancient Mediterranean studies? How are we defining our subject matter? And that, of course, difficult because classicists study so many different things.
Mm-hmm.
So civilization is probably a decent term if you're talking about, a particular society in a particular time and place. Um, People, argue even about, well, what dates, what do we mean when we say the Roman Empire? What are the exact, what's the end date that we're putting on that? So when the closer you look at something, the blurrier the boundaries always get. But certainly, as someone who was not familiar with the game, I think the name, now that I've looked at it a little bit, the name Civilizations is not so bad.
Yeah, I enjoy. I've had a few classicists on this series, and I always like hearing their perspective on this topic of civilization because it is one that, for myself as a modernist, it's like, oh boy, definitely don't use that word, right? Don't ever use that word. But for classicists and for scholars of ancient antiquity in general, I think it's still a word that is somewhat useful, particularly when you're talking about the Greek and the Roman world. And, when you talk about Cleopatra's Egypt, you're talking about Ptolemaic Egypt, which I think the Games Encyclopedia does a pretty good job of, going through here and talking about general Egyptian history, but then also focusing here on Ptolemaic Egypt and how Cleopatra and her family members were different, were kind of a cut different from, the kind of older kingdoms of Egyptian history. So, I think when you place it in that kind of guise, with focusing on the kind of Greek nature of, Cleopatra's Egypt, that it is a term that makes a bit more sense, I think, than maybe, applied to, for instance, this game has you give you the opportunity to play as the American civilization, which always feels very, very weird to me.
I would refer to oneself as a civilization. With the word civilization, I guess I became more aware of that term when I started teaching at Montclair,
Mm-hmm.
because in terms of the course catalog nomenclature that we actually use the word civilization a lot.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's almost like instead of the word history, like Roman history, like our Roman history survey course is called Roman civilization.
Yeah.
And we have, that sort of goes through various, there's a Chinese civilization course. So a lot of our history courses have that word civilization in the title. So maybe it just doesn't seem weird to me.
Right. Well, and yeah, it could be the case. I teach a community college in North Texas, and we still have Western Civ courses. I teach them,
Yeah.
and
No,
but there's a lot of hand wringing that goes on behind the scenes. It's like, oh, should we still call this
right.
Western Civ? Like, oh, is this bad? There's kind of a lot of
Yeah.
questions on that regard.
Yeah, I think classicists and historians have some of these same anxieties. Um, yes, well, it's always hard to name things. We recently added a new minor to our list of programs, and it's called Ancient Mediterranean Civilizations, plural.
Well, that
So
yeah,
we
yeah,
have the word civilization where I am.
yeah. Then maybe it's just us. Then I don't know.
I mean, it seems to be a useful term, and the thing is, it's a good. I think it's a good term to communicate with because students who haven't taken the course yet
Yeah.
are really familiar with that terminology.
That's the way that I think about it, and I begin each Western Civ class with kind of a long introduction of the syllabus, obviously, but then also a long introduction of the term Western and then civilization, and just kind of
Yeah.
problematizing a little bit for the students. So it's like, well, I'm glad you were interested in this course. You saw the title and you thought it was interesting, but here, let me try to like ruin everything you think you know about the
Yeah,
West
the
and
closer you
civilization.
look at it, and as my class starts to look more closely at the Romans, they find that the Romans as a monolithic term is not actually that precise or that
Mm-hmm.
useful in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
instances.
Yeah. Um, so last question here. Previous games in the Civilization series, and now this is a game series that goes back 30 years. Previous titles in this series, they've used leaders for the Egyptian Civ, including Ramesses II and Hatshepsut as leaders for Egypt. And I'm just wondering, besides Cleopatra the Seventh, can you think of any other potential leaders for the Egyptian Civ going forward that the game developers might consider?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Alexander the Great comes to mind uh, because he had the huge empire, and there's lots of cool information about him. Um, if they wanted to go a little, oh, do you have Alexander there? I see. Uh, if you wanted to go a little, more deep cut, you could do the Persian ruler Cambyses, who
Ooh.
invaded Egypt in 525 BC, and a second century AD historian Polyaenos, who I think got a little creative with the facts, has a great story about the Persians having this strategy to conquer the Egyptians, where as they marched in to invade, they put cats in front of their battle line so the Egyptians wouldn't want to attack them, and lest they hurt the cats. So that would be a funny one.
Yeah, that would be great.
But yeah, I
Wow.
mean, I feel like the Persian rule of Egypt does not get its due in history classes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And, on the point of Alexander, he is actually a part of a kind of a major change with this version of Civilization. So, previous
Yeah,
versions, Alexander had been the kind of the de facto leader of the Greek Civ in the game. But in this iteration of Civilization 6 in this game, they've split off Alexander into his own Civ for Macedon.
I
And
think
then for Greece, they have, I believe it's Pericles and Gorga. And so, you get kind of an option there. But another interesting aside, before I let you respond, is that in this version of Civilization, they have got certain leaders, including Eleanor of Aquitaine, who can double as the leader of two different civs. So Eleanor here can be the leader of England, or she can be, let's see, I think it's the second one here. She can be the leader of France. And so I wonder if maybe the developers could consider a similar thing with the Egyptian
yeah.
Civ. Maybe have Alexander be a potential leader for Egypt or a potential leader for Macedon. Or you could have, as you just mentioned, this Persian leader of Persia, and then maybe a potential leader for Egypt as well. I think
So
there's maybe potential there.
the corresponding Egyptian leader to Cambyses would be Amasis II. So you could definitely have the two of them go at it.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think that's a really fascinating point you bring up. It's kind of,
Yeah.
and like you had said earlier, kind of problematizing this idea of what is Roman.
Yeah.
Obviously with the Egyptians under the Ptolemaic Empire, what is Egyptian? I think there is a lot of ways in which this game could be opened up to diversify our idea of what constitutes a civilization, what constitutes Egypt or Rome or any of these other groups.
Exactly. There's a lot of potential there. One assignment I sometimes give my students in my course on Cleopatra is a sort of a speculative history assignment. I asked them to imagine that Antony and Cleopatra had won the Battle of Actium, won the war against Octavian, and then go ahead and write me a short summary of what happens instead of the Roman Empire.
Mm.
So that one's always a lot of fun. And they usually come up with that there would have been an empire, but it would have been much more balanced between East and West.
Mm-hmm. Because
So that has a lot
Anthony was still very popular in
yes,
Rome, despite the battle, despite the Civil War, right?
he definitely had backing in Rome. It was not, it's easy when we read it from the perspective of knowing how it turned out to sort of, see Octavian as always being on top. But, being in the midst of it, perhaps the perspective would have been somewhat different. By the way, the Alexander portrait that
Oh yeah,
the game has that you had up a minute ago,
I'll go back to that right now.
I love it. Love it because it's not just a drawn version of our ancient Alexander portraits, but it still has the lock of hair on the forehead.
Yeah.
Like, they kept that one little bit of iconography, so it's just wonderful.
Good. Yeah. I'm glad. Yeah. I wish. So if you were to come across Macedonia in this game, you would enter into a diplomatic screen that looks very similar to this one, where you'd see the fully fleshed out character model for Alexander, and he is, he's got the face that you saw there in the Civilopedia, but then his body is just full body armor, very masculine, very muscular, and he kind of he reminds me of. I don't know if you know the film Fast Times at Ridgemont High,
Yes.
but Spicoli, the Sean Penn character in that movie, I mean, he's like a carbon copy of Alexander in this game.
That's an interesting little reception mashup right there, Alexander. I like that. This is very clever. I'm enjoying watching this on my screen.
All right. Well, that does it for my questions. Prudence, thank you so much for joining me on Civs 101.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And dear listener, if you enjoy Civs 101 or History Respawn more generally, please check out our archive on historyrespawn.com. And if you really enjoy our work, please consider supporting us on Patreon by going to patreon.com/historyrespawn. And until next time, goodbye.